If you've been wondering what's going on with these lynx and wild boars showing up in the Highlands of Scotland and about rewilding generally in Scotland of the legal and illegal kind, I want to show you this clip from my conversation with Pete Cairns of Scotland, the Big Picture. There was a big poll that came out in the wake of that huge news story of lynx being dumped on a hillside in the Cairngorms, which suggested that just 13%, 13% of the Scottish population are now opposed to the idea of lynx reintroduction. Is that your experience? Because you're in the thick of this, Pete. I should have said at the start, you founded and have been the rewilding lead at Scotland, the Big Picture. You're at the centre of this national conversation around rewilding landscapes, nature restoration, species reintroduction, and you live in the heart of this in the Highlands. Is this your experience that just 13% of people are opposed to lynx?
Yeah, I think it's a constantly evolving and maturing conversation, but it is much more mature than it was just 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago. I think part of the problem with lynx, specifically with lynx, is that very few people know what they are. We have a sort of a cultural association with wolves and bears. We feel as though we know them through childhood stories. We don't, of course, but we kind of feel as though we do. Whereas lynx doesn't figure in our sort of cultural history. So a big barrier for restoring lynx is lack of knowledge, and it's been our mission for the last 3 or 4 years to help plug those knowledge gaps so that people's opinions, they may not be the same as mine, but at least they're better informed. And I think the other, just to illustrate that, what I often come across is people conflating lynx with wolves. They all go in this big bag of apex predators. And of course, wolves and lynx are very, very different animals. And we're not even having a conversation about wolves. So I think, plugging knowledge gaps and informing people about lynx leads to some of them, not all of them, but some of them supporting the return of what is effectively a medium-sized cat that very, very few people are ever going to see.
Yeah, they call them ghosts of the forest in Scandinavia, because you can live all your life out in the sticks and never see one. Just the footprints or maybe the remnants of the odd roe deer kill. It has been said to me that if we want lynx back, we just need to talk incessantly about wolves. I guess that's the kind of Donald Trump strategy. Ask for a yard and get an inch. I wonder. Where the real concerns lie. It's not presumably the general population. It's presumably focused around those who have sheep. That's probably the most difficult bit of lynx. The fact that they may take sheep.
Yes, and I think we did a survey, a sort of social feasibility study back in 2021, and there were lots of concerns, some legitimate, others less so, but there were 5 main barriers. And you're absolutely right. The biggest barrier by far is fear of livestock predation, predominantly sheep. And it's a legitimate concern. Let's not sugarcoat this. Lynx will take some sheep. Now, there are all sorts of horror stories of how many, and the extreme outliers are countries like Norway, which has a very, very specific set of circumstances, which leads to quite high predation. But if you're using as a comparison countries similar to Scotland, such as Germany or Switzerland, for example, sheep predation within a wider context is very, very, very low. So the concerns of sheep farmers are not unfounded by any means. But I think we have to take that into context. The fact that given all of the causes of sheep deaths in the UK, the addition of lynx is going to make very, very little difference.
Yeah, because approximately 10% of sheep die of natural causes every year, and there's 30 to 40 million sheep in Britain, depending on the time of year, and there's somewhere between 3 and 5 million of them die of exposure and falling off cliffs, or overload of parasites, or getting their eyes pecked out by corvids. The list just goes on and on. They seem to search for ways to die, sheep, and so I have understood that in places like France and Switzerland, Germany, predation by lynx and even wolves that really will go for sheep, it's still a kind of rounding error against the wider context. And coexistence measures are becoming more and more advanced and more widely adopted on the continent. Things like fencing and dogs, and people trying all sorts of different things. And it really is starting to work. And the European Union has until now been quite generous in its support of these kinds of efforts, as well as providing compensation. Well, national governments and the EU combined will provide compensation to those farmers that do lose livestock. This is really a lack of knowledge, combined with some legitimate fears around livestock predation, combined with a bit of a kind of culture wars conversation around rewilding generally, which strikes me as the biggest issue. You see some of these GB News presenters, for example, saying, that rewilding is about bringing, a new round of Highland clearances. These Rory Stewart, who's once said on his podcast that people like Ben Goldsmith want half the country to be Alaska, full of wildlife with no people, and the other half to be like Iowa, farmed industrially, which of course is a million miles, from anything I've ever said. I believe that rewilding is a way to breathe new life back into the economy and into the society of some of these remoter landscapes that have been struggling a bit. But this culture war is presumably an issue, and that's what Scotland the Big Picture is all about. It's about tackling that culture war head on and persuading people of a more vibrant future with more nature.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That the popular media have tended to frame rewilding as a binary choice, really, between the needs of nature and those of people. And we can't have both. We can't possibly have both. And I think, we recognise that pitching one against the other will end up serving neither. So, yeah, we often say that rewilding is 20% ecology and 80% psychology. The ecology bit, beavers in the river, trees in the ground, peatlands restored, that's the easy bit in many ways. The battleground, if indeed you want to call it a battleground, is for people's hearts and minds. And you're absolutely right. In fact, just going back to the lynx, I was really, really interested on how the media portrayed that whole incident against that backdrop of conflict and sensationalism that they tend to feast on. And to be fair, I was genuinely pretty pleasantly surprised about the measured and responsible way that the media went about reporting that incident. So, yeah, whether that's a maturing of the narrative generally or a recognition of the media, this is not a people versus nature thing is yet to be seen. But I do see an improvement in the reporting of rewilding related stories across the media.
Yeah, I do too. And also this idea of rewilding as being a people-led activity, one that doesn't involve the sort of sweeping of livelihoods from the land. Certainly in an English context, where our remoter landscapes are more actively managed by farmers. You don't have these swathes of open ground which have lots of deer, but which aren't farmed in the way that the Lake District or the Pennines or Dartmoor are. There's a growing understanding that a farmer-led nature recovery is arguably the best outcome. To listen to the full podcast episodes, please search for Rewilding the World on whatever app you use to get your podcasts.